For those I haven't met, my name is Tom Simpson. I'm a faculty member here at the Blavatnik School. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and public policy, and it's a real pleasure to chair this series thinking about international perspectives on conservatism. And the thought behind the series is just that conservative thought has a rich intellectual history and which is worthy of exploration, but also that conservative thought is heterogeneous internationally. There's diversity within it, and located here in the UK, it's very easy to understand the UK conservative tradition, and obviously very influenced by the US tradition, increasingly so. But actually we need to broaden our gaze and think about these questions from an international comparative perspective. And so to that end, it's just a real pleasure to welcome Professor Lucia Santa Cruz with us tonight. Lucia Santa Cruz is a distinguished historian from Chile. She's formerly Dean of the Faculty of Liberal Arts at the Adolfo Ibáñez University. Spanish speakers, please, can I just apologise in advance? I will get things repeatedly wrong, and I ask your mercy. She's a member of the Board of Liberty and Development Institute and of the Chilean Academy of Social, Political and Moral Sciences. She was previously a professor of modern universal history at the Institute of History of the Catholic University of Chile, and she received her MPhil from St Anthony's College here in Oxford and PhD from King's College, University of London. She's the author of several books and publications, most recently La Igualdad Liberal, or Liberal Equality in English speakers in 2018, a columnist for El Mercurio, and I've been learning about her career in journalism as well and the influential political impacts of that career itself, although her engagement in political life has been, as it were, from the academy, contributing to political discourse there. So without further ado, Lucia will kindly speak to us maybe for 20 or 30 minutes or so, and then we'll just have a chance for open conversation at that point. So would you join me in welcoming her?
Thank you. I'm always terrified of extending myself. Sorry, my spectacles. Oh, dear. Well, good evening, and thank you very, very much for your invitation to participate in this very interesting project. Well, it is obvious that in such a short time, it's impossible to give a complete account of the many ways conservative thought has evolved in Chile according to time and circumstances over 200 years since independence. So I chose 4 points which I thought are interesting, and 2 more if there is time during discussion. First of all, what do we mean by Chilean conservative thought? Secondly, how did this conservative thinking influence the building of a nation and a conservative republic, particularly between 1830 and 1860? And for that, I will refer to the 1833 Constitution, which I would define as a liberal conservative political expression of liberal conservatism, and make a reference to Andrés Bello, to me the epitome of a Burkean liberal conservative. Thirdly, I would like to explain the change in the dividing axis between liberals and conservatives, and how, from the early dilemma between liberty and order, it changed into the relationship between church and state. And finally, the great paradox of how conservatives, in their determination to secure the rights of the Catholic Church, became defenders of civil liberties, threatened by liberal policies that increased the power of the government to impose religious pluralism, secularization, and above all, the state's control of education. Furthermore, it is in the Conservative Party that we find the real followers of classical liberal economics of Adam Smith and others, while liberals are more in favor of state control, giving the first signs of a quest for liberty in association with positive equality. Then for discussion, I thought it might be interesting to talk about 2 deviations from classical liberal conservatism, which in my view has been the school of thought that has had actual political expression throughout our democratic history. and I refer to an intellectual movement of the first part of the 20th century, which was anti-liberal, anti-democracy, anti-suffrage, which did not have a political expression, but was very influential historiographically and intellectually in the media, etc. And eventually they did have some influence on the young generation that contributed to the constitutional doctrine of the military government of Pinochet. And the other point that I would like to touch on, if we have time during the conversation, is my theory that, contrary to what some people feel, the new right, which a lot of people call the extreme right, has very little foundations of a liberal conservative way. And why? Well, what do we mean by Chilean conservative thought? Someone once said, Mario Góngora, that the key factor to understand conservative thinking in Chile was the fact that we Chileans had not experienced the pathos of the French Revolution, the violence and total disruption of the Catholic Church and of the social order. This is not, of course, to say that the French Revolution did not have an influence in the early years of the Chilean Republic. The Jacobin experience was known, often referred to, and certainly it provoked fear and rejection for a long time, to the detriment of the idea of democracy, which did not become acceptable until the idea of representation gave guarantees that it was not the equivalent of mob rule. What it does mean is that this lack of the inspiring pathos gives Chilean early conservative thought characteristics far removed from the European continental roots. It was not reactionary, not monarchical, did not aspire to a restoration of the old regime. It believed in liberty, but within a framework of order and law, was not a defender of the status quo, but saw themselves as the leaders of progress, but through gradual reform and not through revolution. Its thinkers and politicians did not think society was static or inalterable, and they never appealed to an immemorial Hispanic tradition as the main foundation of the new order. The legitimating principle of conservatism, as of liberalism, was the idea of the republic. It did, however, have distinct links with the Catholic Church. In fact, the Conservative Party as such was born under the protection of the Church, and Catholicism was always an essential part of its identity. We might maybe agree that conservatism is not an ideology as such. It cannot be defined monolithically, and is not a universal blueprint that can be applied regardless of time and circumstances. As it's often said, it is a mentality, an attitude, a rejection of abstractions over the complexities of human life, hostile to utopianism, and with a belief in institutions, respect for tradition, moderation and prudence, respect for authority, but not any authority, only that expressed in law, skeptical of radical schemes to overturn the social order, and intent in the safeguarding of personal freedoms. In the case of Chile, what we find, as from the 1830s, is a kind of classical liberal conservatism of clear Burkean or Tocquevillean inspiration. Something I cannot prove, nobody has proved, but as Simon Collier stated, Chilean conservative thinkers seem to have been Burkean, whether they were aware of it or not. Chilean conservatives believed above all in the need of order and authority, constitutional rule with separation of power as a bulwark against despotism, equality before the law, and civil liberties. However, according to circumstances and changes, the balance between law and order on the one side and liberty on the other shifts permanently. But above all, in the early foundation of the Republic, most certainly the great emphasis was on the need to avoid chaos and anarchy and create institutions to guarantee political stability after the first decade of experiment and conflict. Now, how did this conservative thought contribute to the building of a nation? The struggle for independence was not an attempt to achieve radical egalitarianism, religious tolerance, or changes in the social structure. But it was a time of great upheaval. It was a revolution. It involved a profound change in the concept of sovereignty, but it was also a civil war, followed by political instability, constitutional trials and errors, institutional fragility, the militarization of society, interethnic tensions, emergence of caudillos, financial deficit because of the prolonged struggle. So the main challenge was to put an end to political experimentation, which had culminated on another civil war, which ended in 1830 with the triumph of the conservative forces that were to rule for the next 30 years. And this, I think, set the basis for what was to be the today questioned concept of Chilean exceptionalism, rooted in the belief that Chile's unique historical circumstances set it apart from its regional neighbors. It refers to the establishment, earlier than others, of solid republican institutions which were to be the foundation of a constitutional tradition, something that did not happen in other nations in the continent, and which has accompanied all our constitutional evolution with the interruption, several times, of course, by civil confrontations. The constitution that was approved in 1833, that was the pillar of this foundation, pretended to institutionalize the legacy of the independence, and it gave expression to the conservative institutional idea of order and liberty. It was a very clear expression of this permanent dilemma in our history between order and freedom. Its objective was to create a check on the excessive, quote, protection of liberty of the previous 1828 Constitution, which had led to civil confrontation. However, there was also an element of continuity even with that previous charter. In essence, it guaranteed representation, obviously with limited suffrage, separation of powers, equality before the law, individual guarantees, right of petition, the right of Congress to approve the budget, the inviolability of property, freedom of movement, of printing, etc. However, because in this choice between order and liberty, they definitely opted for order, at the same time as establishing a representative liberal republic, it gave the president ample prerogatives, not only to appoint provisional authorities, members of the armed forces, the right to, but the most important was the right to declare state of emergency in case of public disorders, which meant in practice, very often, restricting liberties, particularly freedom of the press, in order, it was thought, to protect from anarchy and instability post-Civil War. For liberal historiography, these times were nothing more than legal dictatorships, where sovereignty did not belong to the people, but to the president. However, it must be said, like Simon Collier, still one of the best scholars in Chilean history, some liberal sectors were quite indulgent of civil disorders and benevolent to the idea of revolution, even if it meant civil war. Notably, he quotes a liberal newspaper where Jefferson is remembered saying that the tree of freedom must be irrigated with the blood from time to time, and, quote, a civil war inspires generous feelings, gives the country glorious examples and gains progress almost always for humanity. To sum up, liberal and conservative doctrines at that time are not antagonic concepts. They have an underlying common ground, and that is the conviction that a representative government and a republic are the best form of government. But above all, conservatives, I think, privileged the stability of the republic over the liberty of its citizens. Andrés Bello was born in Venezuela, but it is considered rightly the most important Chilean intellectual. I think he was clearly influenced by Burke. We know that in his library was found Burke's reflection on the French Revolution, although it is impossible to prove a direct connection. He lived in London between 1810 and 1829. I must point out that over 70 members of the Hispanic elite lived in England between 1808 and 1830. He was a great admirer of the British Constitution because it prevented absolute power. At first, he was in favor of monarchy, but very soon he became convinced that the real challenge was to transition from absolute monarchy to a republic built on popular sovereignty and equality before the law. In the case of Chile, although he was by temperament a liberal mind, he was in favor of granting extraordinary powers to the executive to defend the government from insubordination produced by what he called the excesses of democracy. Because for him, as for Burke, real, effective, empirical liberty could not be established without enforcing order, virtue, and above all, the rule of law. He was the great instigator of the idea that the law was the fundamental pillar in the construction of nations. He was convinced despotism should be checked, but, I quote, ardor of immoderate liberty, which can result in appalling anarchy, should be quelled. And of course, law should not be invented from zero and should have an element of continuity. But the most important thing for him was the education of the people so as to have citizens willing to abide by the most relevant objective of the new nation, and that was the establishment and consolidation of the law and of civic and moral virtues as the basis of the republic. Thus, we can safely say Bello was a conservative in relation to the liberalism that would emerge in the 1850s, and a liberal in relation to followers of absolute monarchy. As Ivan Jaksic, the most authoritative biographer of Bello, has written, one of the most significant aspects of Bello's concept of law is its relationship with the notion of freedom, as opposed to that of license. For Bello, freedom resided in the exercise of individual rights, but only to the extent that it did not interfere with those of others. License, on the other hand, represented precisely the opposite, meaning to act without regard for the rights of other members of society. True freedom, in that sense, was for Bello the disciplined submission to the law. Now, briefly, so to leave more time for conversation, what about what I call the breaking up of the Catholic consensus and its consequences on the conservative-liberal division? As from the late 1840s, one can detect a change of mentality and of the prevailing climate of opinion of the country. The conservative order had unplanned consequences of creating a more secure atmosphere, and this, paradoxically, allowed and stimulated freer public debate, and that and the expansion of education, quite notable in those years, allowed for a liberalization that was reflected in institutional mechanism in many ways led by the same conservative government, by Congress, schools, and the press. In this context, the fundamental consensus was broken on the issue of the role of the Catholic Church in a plural republic, or as the title of the book of Sol Serrano says, what do we do with God in the Republic? And as from the 1860s, one can say that the divisive axis between liberals and conservatives is no longer order versus liberty, but the relationship between the state and the church. Well, in the case of Chile, after independence, the unity between the state and the church and the submission of the church to the authority of the government, which had prevailed during the colony and had been granted by the papacy to the crown, were maintained, as this submission was considered essential to national sovereignty. In this way, it was the government that held the authority to propose and appoint bishops. It could intervene in the administration of the church, set the boundaries of dioceses and their parishes, could determine whether a new cloistered convent could or could not be founded, and it had to approve papal orders for them to take effect in the country. This implied, amongst other things, the subordination of priests as citizens to national authorities, allowing them to appeal to ordinary courts of justice against the decisions of their ecclesiastical superiors. The church was thus dependent on the state, and the state gave it certain exclusive rights. Catholicism was the obligatory religion for all, was exempt from taxes, so the government could keep economic control in its hands. The public cult of other religions, creeds, was forbidden, and all sorts of conflicts, too long to describe here, arose about marriages, cemeteries, and above all, education between the church and the new liberal governments. During the previous years of the Conservative Republic, 1830-1860, there were no special clashes between government and church in cultural or social matters, as all members of the government were Catholics, and their objectives were fundamentally shared. However, insofar as a greater liberalization, secularization surged, and as Protestant immigration grows, and when liberal governments start to be elected, governments start losing their Catholicity. This means that the legitimacy of the political system is no longer religious, but legal, so that religion became one of the debatable subjects as never before. Well, finally, and with this I really do end, the great paradox is that conservatives became the true defenders of civil liberties, while liberals defended the power of the state to enforce greater secularization, and above all, to ensure government control of education. In this sense, conservatives become the real followers of classical liberalism in its defense of individual rights and also of economic liberal policies. Maybe at this point I should define briefly what I mean by classical liberalism. Liberalism being such a porous concept that has to be defined every time it's used. In essence, the liberalism I refer to in this context is limited in its objectives and modest in its metaphysical aspirations, and it's associated with the idea that it is important to contain the prerogatives of government owing to its potential to hinder the freedom of its citizens. It is associated to the rule of law, above discretional or arbitrary power, to the value of individual rights, especially thought, expression, religion, press, association, etc. In essence, it is a theory of limited government through a series of checks and balances to constrain its powers. One of the most relevant consequences of the introduction of classical liberalism is the emergence of a distinction between the public and the private spheres, founded on the idea that there are spaces unique to each individual, spaces that for the first time include various activities that had until then been subjected to the public sphere. the absolute state or the community or whatever. And these activities for the first time include family life, the economy, and religion, all of which must be free from the intervention of authority. That is to say, they should not be subjected to or decided by any sovereignty external to the will of the individual. Hence, for classical liberalism, the central problem lies in defining the relationship between the state and civil society, between the collective and the individual. And in Chile, this applied to the relationship between the church and the state. Well, as we said, once the government lost the Catholic consensus, the dividing axis shifted, as I've tried to explain. There is a phrase from Valentin Letelier, a member of the liberal radical emerging party, where he attacks what he calls, quote, the liberal strategy of the conservatives, because it is necessary to enforce state authoritarianism to advance the cause of liberty. For that school of thought, the conservatives only apparently defended civil liberties, because their real purpose was to keep the citizens under the dominion of religious beliefs, which prevented them from autonomy and free thought. For them, liberty did not mean political autonomy or individual rights. They must be subordinated to the overriding aim of secularizing the nation. Well, to sum up, at the beginning of the 19th century and during the so-called conservative governments, as I've tried to explain, there was a confluence of interest between the governmental and ecclesiastical sectors, stemming from the predominantly Catholic integration of members of the government and their shared objectives. This meant that the tensions between them were relatively minor. Then the governments, now predominantly liberal, began to lose their Catholic identity, and this signified, as Sol Serrano and Ivan Jaksic have written in an essay, the principle of legitimacy of the political system had been secularized. It was juridical and not religious. When Catholic unanimity was lost, religion would become one of the debatable topics in the context of an embryonic public space. Well, as a counterpart, and I'm going to be brief about this, Catholic demanded greater autonomy and freedom for the church, and this struggle led to the unusual fact that it was prominent conservative leaders like Abdon Cifuentes or Zorobabel Rodriguez who emerged as the defenders of individual liberties and the integrity of the public space. It was within this context of their crusade for freedom of expression, the right to profess the Catholic faith without state intervention, the rights to associate and to assembly, the freedom of education without state monopolies, that these politicians and intellectuals could be integrated into a current of classical liberal thought. The most grievous issue was the liberal imposition of state exclusivity and monopoly of all education at schools and university levels. And this is an issue relevant to this day. And when one reads the debates between liberals and conservatives in the 19th century, one is amazed at the resemblance of what the educational discussion is about today in Chile. In summary, in the Chilean case, the liberal-conservative divide is conceptually very different from that in Europe and is expressed from the 1860s onwards almost exclusively along a clerical, anti-clerical, Catholic secularist axis. Certainly in practice, but also in abstract discussion, both conservatives and liberals were equally willing at different times to use state power to benefit their visions. However, this does not negate the fact that the Liberal Party in many of its actions encroached upon significant spheres of individual autonomy with conservatives being the ones responsible for incorporating these rights and liberties into our institutional framework. As Cifuentes remarked, liberals defend the freedom of all, except that of Catholics. I will stop here and see if we can talk about something else during the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Lucia, thank you very much. And so I'm learning loads here, and it's really fascinating. So can I just start off with a historical question, please? So you described, I think, did you call it the Catholic consensus, whereby the state had very significant powers and prerogatives in relation to the administration of the Catholic Church, and in return enforced effectively compulsory religion, Catholic observance. When did that begin to, can you give us a sense of the period when that began to break down? And so freedom of religion then begins to advance as a claim for individuals at that point.
I think after the Conservative governments, well, previously there is an intellectual movement in favor of secularization, in favor of pluralism. This coincided with a much greater Protestant immigration, and this unique status of the Catholic Church as the only religion to be publicly professed did produce a lot of conflicts. For instance, a Protestant who wanted to be buried in a Catholic church because he was married to a Catholic or because his family wanted it, was not allowed to be buried in a... So in the 1870s, there is a strong liberal movement to secularize cemeteries, to flexibilize marriages, to allow mixed marriages between Protestants and Catholics. And I think, but this is a movement that starts intellectually in the 1850s, I think.
Okay. And is that movement contested by the Catholic Church at that point? Because you can see there's a clear quid pro quo. So thinking of 20th century political, theological thought, one of the key doctrines in the American context, a lot of Catholic writers at the time, so I'm thinking of people like Courtney Murray, I think his name is, are articulating for the freedom of the church, where it's the collective freedom of the church, which is a really foundational concept. So the prior Catholic consensus you're describing is one where the church does not enjoy collective freedom, but the quid pro quo is individuals also don't enjoy it. But the assertion of individual freedom may come at the there's certain kinds of losses for the Catholic Church in that situation.
Yes. Well, the Catholic Church, the papacy, the Vatican, never accepted this subordination of the Church. They felt that this privilege that they had been granted to the Crown was not something to be inherited by a republic whose legitimacy was still questioned in the old world. So there was always an objection to this state control. It's very complex because in the same way as liberals begin to advocate pluralism and the rights of other churches, etc., there are quite a lot of initiatives which tend to restrict the freedom of the Catholic Church. You know, at one point there was a terrible fire in the church during a special celebration of the Virgin Mary's feast. And over nearly 3,000 women died in the fire. And it was thought that it was because of the veils they used and the candles. And the great campaign led by the liberals started to prohibit certain rites, certain religious ceremonies, to prohibit the foundation of convents because it withdrew the autonomy of those who took permanent vows. So there was a lot of contradiction within the Conservatives, because frankly, if you think that religion belongs to the private area, you should also accept that Protestants have that right. And liberals, if they believe that the church should not have special rights, they should not at the same time deny them what is the legitimate exercise of their religion.
Okay, this is very interesting. So there was a phrase you used, which I think you ascribed to another thinker, which really jumped out at me. So the comment was, true freedom is the disciplined submission to law.
I love that phrase.
Yeah.
That's Andrés Bello.
Okay. And one of the questions, so I know you've worked on Isaiah Berlin previously, and so Isaiah Berlin has this distinction between what he calls positive and negative conceptions of liberty. And as a kind of very rough and ready version, a negative conception of liberty would be one in which you're free from certain kinds of interference, paradigmatically of the individual, whereas positive liberty is sometimes described as freedom to. I think maybe at a deeper level it's something more like the self-mastery to choose what is good, for which sometimes external constraints can actually become enabling, to enable you to choose what is good. So one of the questions that I had as I was listening to you describe these different political traditions was actually, is there a consistent espousal in either positive liberty or of negative liberty?
Well,
and I found myself thinking, actually, I think both sides are espousing forms of positive liberty at one kind. So there's this conservative valuation, discipline, submission to the law, and then actually the secular liberals also have a version of positive liberty.
Yeah. And the antagonism becomes very clear when conservatives become the defenders of individual rights, because what they're defending is negative freedom.
Yeah.
And while liberals, Amunati and other leaders of the time, insinuate a concept of liberty which is very linked to equality. And in that sense, it's very much a more positive, less individual form of... I'm not sure I agree, though, that it's the... No, it's different. I withdraw.
Okay. Okay. So two more questions just from me, and then we'll throw it open to wider discussion here. So just last week we had Jennifer Burns from Stanford talking about different strands of influence in American conservatism, one of which is the libertarian strand and she's worked on both written a biography of Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand as well previously. And I know Milton Friedman specifically had links with Chile and Chilean conservatism. Can you just say what was the influence there? What did he take back influences from Chile back to his own work? How's Chilean conservatism connected with a wider international network of conservative thinking?
Well, certainly both Friedman and Hayek had influence on the economic doctrine and on the economic policies. I don't think they had a greater influence than that. I had the opportunity of interviewing Hayek, and at the time where the theory of homo economicus was absolutely unquestioned, and human beings were simply producers. He gave me a sentence, which of course I put as headline, which said, an economist who is only an economist is a bad economist. So I think he had greater vision. But Milton Friedman, I think, was merely economic. Okay. But of course, there was a link between Pinochet and the Thatcher government, etc. There was and Reagan. There was a point when there was a group of people thinking in the same way, but mainly economically.
Yeah, good.
I think that is different to what I call the new right, which is emerging. Which the point I wanted to make is that this new right, contrary, as I said, to what people think, or many people think, it's certainly not liberal conservative. Does not belong to a school of classical liberalism. First of all, because they do not admit the theory of knowledge, which underlines liberalism, and that is that knowledge on political, economic matters is conjectural and subject to refutation. They are dogmatic on the absolute truth of their beliefs. I don't want to offend anybody, but that is the case of Milei in Argentina. That's one thing. there is no, I do think that liberalism has contributed to some virtues like tolerance and pluralism. But the aggressive rhetoric of people like Millet or Trump, I think, are very unconducive to tolerance and pluralism and respect for differences.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I don't think anyone would take Millet or Trump for Burkeans.
Certainly not.
And maybe just my last one. And this is really, your reference to Pinochet kind of leads into this. So forms of military rule, military dictatorship in particular, are in some sense located on the right. And military rule in that way was a feature of many countries in South America, Latin America. How has the Conservative movement, in a wider sense, responded to that? Has it, as it were, come out from under the shadow of that military leadership? Does it remain, is there a romantic ideal that remains in some strands around that? It'd just be great to hear your sense of, a commitment to Republican rule of law seems in tension with that leadership.
In the case of the military dictatorship of Pinochet, I think there was a clear difference between the traditional conservative parties, conservative and liberal parties, which basically in the whole of their history adhered to liberal democracy, and this new conservative thought that I referred to that emerged intellectually with historians, thinkers, which were very influential. They were clearly of a much more cooperative tendency. They did not believe in democracy, as I said. They certainly not universal suffrage. But this was not unanimous because the influence of the Chicago School of Economics, which was libertarian in economic matters, had influence on other issues as well. So at the beginning, there was an attempt to draw up a constitution with clear cooperative tendencies. But fundamentally, they were defeated because somehow these young leaders, Jaime Guzman, who was a great inspirer of the 1980 Pinochet Constitution, had an evolution in his thought. And from being, Frankist, etc., he was convinced of the Chicago tendencies. So,
okay. Great, thank you so much. So who would like to come in? I just saw a question. Sorry. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, please. Yep.
Do I need this? I think I've got a...
We need it for the online audience. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. It shouldn't be. Yeah.
Just to go back to the 19th century and your focus, and I very much agree, I suppose partly because my ideas are very much formed by Simon Collier, that the church-state conflict is a sort of key wedge issue which drives apart this kind of approximate consensus from the mid-19th century onwards. But historians of Latin America in general have often argued that there are other issues dividing liberals and conservatives, which you haven't had time to perhaps touch on. And I wondered if you could just look at two. One is the supposed, and I say supposed because I'm not entirely convinced of this, but the supposed argument, liberals favour free trade, open mercantile relations with the rest of the world, and conservatives favour tariff protection, and that ties in with certain lobbies within the country. There's a logic to it. Although actually quite often, if you look at particular cases, it doesn't seem to work out so clearly. So I wonder about that for Chile. And the second one, which I think has more sense to it, certainly say in Mexico and Colombia, is a regional difference, whereby liberals tend to be more federalist and believe in decentralization, and the conservatives are more centralist and often want to concentrate greater power in the capital city and the center. Now, yes. Chile is sort of notoriously centralized, yes, even though it's a very big, long country. So I wondered if you could say anything about those two factors, yes, as key wedge issues between liberals and conservatives.
I think centralism certainly was a very key issue because it was part of the idea of forming a stable republic. Centralization, the concentration of the administration of the country was a guarantee of greater order. Because a lot of the civil conflicts that had happened before did have a regional, people in Concepcion led a revolution against the central government. So definitely that is so. And regarding free trade and free markets, etc., the only real intellectuals who defended clearly, more than Friedman almost, very Adam Smith, free trade, free markets, etc., were conservatives. Notably, Zorobabel Rodriguez, whose writings are really very impressive for the time, and Abdol Cifuentes, both Catholics. But then there are other strands of conservatism which are more nationalistic, which are more authoritarian. So it's a puzzle that, it's very difficult to put all the pieces. So that's why I've left out those issues which I quite agree are very important.
Come back. Okay. Who else would like to ask? Eduardo.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Lucia. I want to ask you about, I've never been able to understand fully the partisan division of mid-19th century Chile, because the church state issue doesn't lead to two parties, but to four. Right? We have the nacionales, the conservatives, the radicales, and the liberals. So where does this conservative liberal thinking fits into the practical politics of the country?
Well, I felt I was simplifying the issue, definitely, because among conservatives, at one point they divide between the ultramontanos, I don't know how to say that in English, ultramontanos, okay, and more traditional, more liberal conservatives. And that's why I said, it's very difficult to define conservatives monolithically, because circumstances change. And at one point, there is a liberal-conservative alliance, but then one branch of the conservative form another party. If you think of 20th century conservatism, it's the Christian Democrat Party, which became such an important force in the 20th century, emerges from the Conservative Party. And today, we have different strands of conservatism in Chile. And still, in the center-right, the discussion is very much about moral issues. Abortion, divorce, family, the legitimacy of children born out of wedlock. Those are discussions. There's one of the candidates for the election at the end of the year whose main banner are these issues. And, there are mutual reproaches. I was telling Tom, very often the term conservative or liberal are used as insults. I can be accused of being liberal, and that for a lot of people means being immoral. And other people would say you're conservative, which means you're almost fascist. So, it's extremely difficult to give a complete picture of conservatism in Chile.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very illustrative. And I noticed that you mostly focused on the 19th century, so I would like to push you a little bit more on the 20th century, but before even the military dictatorship of the 1970s. So how liberals and conservatives faced issues such as land reform? Because I've got the impression that in the post-war period, not only from the fairness point of view, like this is an unfair land distribution, but it was also an inefficient land distribution. If you see the major production of wheat or whatever crops during the post-war period, it's mostly flood. So my point is that at some point, liberals and conservatives became illiberals in capitalist terms in the post-war period.
How do you define illiberal?
Against capitalist labor relations. So there was no freedom of movement for the peasants working in the countryside, and the land distribution, they were not paid in monetary terms, right? So that's illiberal from my point of view, right? So how they manage to combine this more republican.
Well, I think economically, Chile did not become a proper capitalist country until 1973. It began. Before that, because they said it's quite, in your question, there's something which there are different opinions. Because you attribute the ineffectiveness of agriculture to the way land was distributed. But there will be a lot of politicians and conservatives and liberals would argue that this was not due to the distribution of land as much as government policy, which fixed the prices, which, for instance, you know that in Chile, it was prohibited to plant vineyards, supposedly to prevent alcoholism. But what this meant was that 3 or 4 vineyards were favored. And when that was liberated, in the 70s, 80s, we had this thriving wine industry. And agriculture became really effective once the change of economic policy happened. So I don't think I don't think one can ask 19th century people to be aware, for instance, that payment not in cash is unfair, because I think that was pre-capitalist way. One of the benefits of capitalism has been precisely that people have been able to sell their labor for money, and therefore they're not slaves, they become autonomous. But certainly liberals and conservatives were very much against land reform because it led to a complete uprooting of cultural production. You know, at the end of the Unidad Popular government, the president said that the country only had flour to make bread for 1 week. So it was a very chaotic. And also, of course, it went against one of the basic principles of classical liberalism, which is the right of property. Most of land reforms were done by de facto takeovers rather than by legislation. So, you know, you can argue that it was liberal in one side, illiberal in another, but some of the basic principles of liberal, classical liberal conservative thought were very much undermined by those. And you're right that I talked more about the 19th century, because what I wanted to point out, basically, because it's important to our discussion today, is that we have had a continuity in our constitutional development. Because most of all, I think, with variations, with exceptions, all our charters have been inspired by the idea of a liberal democratic representation, individual right, respect for property, etc., etc. In all the charters, there is a continuity. And that became a great matter of discussion 2 or 3 years ago, when there was this initiative to create a new constitution, which went against all those basic Republican principles. And that was a constitution that was defeated in the plebiscite by 64% of the vote. Because there is a strong tradition of representative democracy.
Any last questions? Okay, Oysin, this will be the last one. Just quickly.
Muchas gracias por la gran discusión. I was wondering what would be the influence of Hispanismo or Hispanidad in Chilean conservatism. On the one hand, you've mentioned how one of the main focuses of the transition from the monarchy to a republic was crucial. However, then, under Pinochet, which obviously had a huge influence on Chilean conservatism. I think, or one could easily argue that there was a revival of that Hispanismo, right? Pinochet famously was one of the only heads of state who attended Franco's funeral, and so on. So I was wondering whether Chilean conservatism in the 20th century, and even nowadays, has had that revival, and overall, what is the influence of the Hispanic political philosophy in general? Thank you.
Well, that was what I tried to point out by the emergence of these new 20th century conservatives, which was cooperativist, Franquist, and very Hispanist. Jaime Izaguirre was a very influential Chilean historian who influenced a generation of historians. And it was very centered on the importance of our Hispanic heritage and of old Catholicism. And people like Jaime Guzman, who was the inspirator of the Constitution of Pinochet, was very much influenced by those people. And therefore, these tendencies are there, latent. But when it comes to putting them into a constitution, it fails. It's a movement that runs parallel to political reality, because the Conservative Party never departs of its belief in representative democracy. But there are these intellectuals who believe that liberal democracy is the source of all the evils, and therefore should be replaced by cooperative representation. And as I said, you know, the influence in historiography has been very great. And I'm convinced that who writes history has got a lot to say about the future. But of course, we have counterbalances too.
Well, we've had a rich tour of Chile's political traditions and been able to relate them to Latin American and more international strains, and we're very grateful. And will you join me in saying thank you very much to Professor Lucia Santa Cruz? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.